Hello, everyone. So it's 2 o'clock. So I will just get the session started. Today is our final theme, EDI, Equality, Diversity and Inclusion. I'm absolutely delighted to welcome you all here today. So just as people are admitting into the room, if I just ask everyone to mute themselves, that would be really appreciated. So I'll just go through some housekeeping before I hand you over to our keynote speaker. So just some virtual guidance there that's on the screen. So we will be recording the session and you will have access to that afterwards. If I just ask you all to mute while the keynote is presenting, and we can ask you to engage. We encourage engagement throughout. So if you can use the chat function, you can ask questions throughout in the chat. Use the emojis, write comments or add to a kind of opinion or whatever that you have. But we just do ask you to please respect the speaker and respect everyone in the room, because sometimes when we're talking about EDI, there might be some sensitive or what people can relate to and react to. So we just ask everyone to respect one another. We do also, besides engaging with the keynote and the other speakers, if you are a Twitter user, please use the hashtag all capital letters. So it's hashtag QUB LTC 2022. So you can continue that engagement throughout the session and right after the session as well. There is live captions available in terms of accessibility, and there will be a full transcript around 24 to 48 hours afterwards. And we do have a YouTube channel, so all the previous presenters, you can have access to them. And I strongly encourage everyone to move towards the website. There's a lot of other information there. So as I said, it's going to be recorded. And as everyone is coming in, if I can just ask you to mute yourself. So I'm absolutely delighted, a topic that's very close to my own heart, to introduce you to Dr. Akile Hamid. Akile is the head of inclusive education at the London School of Economics and Political Science. She's the lead of the Eden Centre for Educational Enhancement. She's been involved in numerous projects, and her research background is in human geography and sociology, where she's developed innovative and underrepresented and represented research projects on spaces of power and resistance in higher education and social justice. And she's going to talk about a number of these projects as she talks through her keynote. And I'm absolutely delighted to hand over to Akile now, if you want to start uploading your slides. And I will keep an eye on the chat throughout and just take Akile's lead. And we will have time at the end for discussion if you want to kind of like unmute yourself, turn on your camera, or just continue putting comments into the chat. So I'm absolutely delighted to hand over to yourself. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much, Tracy. And sorry, I'm a bit late. I didn't actually have the link to join. So it's really great to be here. And I want to firstly thank QUB for inviting me to this conference and for centering a really important theme around sort of ticking boxes, particularly in relation to the work that I do and that we're all sort of endeavouring in higher education. I haven't been able to attend the previous sessions, unfortunately, because I was down with COVID, but having looked through the themes, I'm really, really grateful to the previous keynotes and paper presentations on exploring aspects of student partnership and sustainability, health and wellbeing in the curriculum, and internationalisation. And I am going to return to some of the themes that have been discussed by the previous speakers, but I also want to question things such as equitable student partnership, belonging versus unbelonging, and how the university frames things such as well-being versus the lived reality for staff and students in the university, and also challenging concepts such as decolonising and diversification and how they've become operationalised in the university setting. And what I really want to do today, and please do put your notes into the chat, questions, comments, to consider this idea of the continuum and how we work collectively to do this work in higher education on inclusive education, and that there's no real start to this work and that there's no real end to it. And it's very much a continuum, and it's very much us working collectively together. But before I sort of proceed with what I'm going to say, I'd really like to set this space up And I've borrowed this principled space document from my colleagues from building the anti-racist classroom. And I use this a lot in my teaching, and this is part of the work that we do at the LSE as well in setting up the space for students and staff in conferences and teaching. So just 5 basic principles for today, in that: be aware of your privilege and take a step back so marginalised people can lead consciously, challenging any implicit hierarchy where gender trumps other dimensions of marginalisation and including race. Believe people's accounts of their experiences of marginalisation and honour people's vulnerability by not disputing their lived experiences, and definitely keeping in mind principle number 1. All the experiences that are shared here may be deeply personal and should be treated in confidence. While we can't guarantee full confidentiality, I'd like to request that unless explicit consent is requested and given, that discussions held in this room should stay in this room. I encourage participants to tweet, make posts, comments and critique, but to also respect other participants. I would urge you not to make derogatory comments or post any person's experience in the room or anything that I share in terms of any narratives without explicit consent. And while these principles are intended to apply to all of us, they are written in recognition of existing power structures that continue to marginalise people of colour, perpetuate anti-blackness and promote white privilege and power. And this should be kept in mind throughout the whole session. Thank you. So the aims of the session, what I want to do is to think about what does higher education look like and set the scene around UK higher education in particular. And I'll firstly sort of focus particularly on home UK students, but also be including international student experience, because having now at the LSE, 70% of our students are international, so we need to acknowledge the international student experience. I will then present some data from Advanced HE on student and staff numbers, and some of you may have already seen this data, and some HESA data as well. The data itself tells a story in numbers. I will then be sharing with you all findings from my own research, which focuses on the experiences of racialised postgraduate and PGR students and staff, predominantly in Russell Group universities. These 2 stories are important. I want you all to think about the physical space of the university as I speak, because to engage with the physical space of the university is to be reminded of the power space has to make one feel inside or outside. Previous research by Puwa on women in Parliament, she argues that space is not only abstract and subject to calculus and homogeneous control, but it is also lived and has interwoven series of local encounters involving sensuous connections and imaginations. And there's also been a lot of work in geography by Kwame Harrison, which looks at the racial spatialization. And I really want you to kind of place yourselves into the space of the university and even in this conference space, whilst I work through what I'm going to discuss. And then finally, I'm going to introduce some of the work that we've been doing at LSE, which is focusing on embedding inclusive education across the whole school and not viewing it as something that's tacked on to either EDI policy, widening participation policy, or something that sits external in a separate centre, but is a whole school approach. So setting the scene. So we all know that the UK higher education sector has become more and more market driven. My own journey into higher education started in 2000, where fees were just being introduced. And my parents really pushed me to go to university because it was a route in for a better life for me. They had arrived in England in the 1970s and they wanted a better life for myself and for my siblings. So university felt like the best thing for me to do. But it was a very different time. And we've seen since the UK has kind of expanded its policy and widening participation and a real push to include and widen the pool of people that come to university. Alongside that, we've seen changes in diversity and inclusion policies in universities. We now have EDI teams and leaders in universities. And we also now have moved on from the widening participation to access and participation. So it's not just about getting students in, but it's about supporting students when they do arrive at university. And this couldn't have come sooner because many of us will be aware of the grade awarding gap that exists between white students and students that identify as Black, Asian, minority ethnic, and also the gap between students that are disabled and non-disabled. So it's a really good move, but we need to ask ourselves, why is it that we have these gaps? Why is there a grade awarding gap? And previously, it's always been sent down to the individual level of the student. So it's always viewed as very much deficit. So we will see on universities' websites, and I've just taken this from a number of different universities. So they'll claim things like whoever you are, wherever you've come from, whatever you're worried about will be here. You see things like let's celebrate and support diverse and inclusive communities. Equality and diversity, think differently and do differently. So this is common. You see this whole exercise happen across websites. And if we think back to 2020 and the murder of George Floyd, there was a huge push from institutions to centre race. And then we look at this picture in data. So this is taken from the recent HESA data, and you can access this on the website. It's really available to you all. And we see a pretty good picture. We're seeing an increase in number of students that have declared disabilities. That doesn't mean all students declare disabilities, because we know not all students do, but we see a really good picture if we look from what was happening in 2016 to where we're at in 2021. And again, with ethnicity, we've seen small steps in growth. We've not had a huge, it's been pretty consistent, as you can see in this data. So this paints a really good picture, I'd say, that we've widened access, but we also know that the majority of students that will identify as Black, Asian and minority ethnic, and students from lower socioeconomic backgrounds, however we define that pool of students, are mainly concentrated in teaching intensive and non-Russell universities. So we have to think about, where do students go to study? Why do they make those decisions as well? If we then go down deeper into the data that Advanced HE has recently put out, and these infographics are all available on the Advanced HE website, we start to see what's going. And then I think it was last week, Kawan Bhopal also presented some of this data. So many of you that attended her talk last week, I'm really sorry for the repeat. But we start to see a gap, right? 90% of professors in the UK are white. 0.6% of professors are Black. Those of us that work in universities and study universities will see this as we walk the corridors, as we go to lectures, as we enter meetings. It's very much apparent. And again, this is a really interesting statistic. If we look at the pipeline for UK students and staff, we see it widening at professor level for white versus BA/ME. That's a huge gap between those two groups. So you can see, as you go through your career path, if you choose to go on to do a PhD, that gap becomes wider and wider. Oops, sorry, I'm really bad on Teams. Oh. Right, here we go. And then if we look at the intersection of this data again, if we look at gender, we look at this, we see white male professors take up 64%. And then we've got, and I'm using Black, Asian, minority ethnic purely for policy purposes, and that's what we're using in the UK. It's not a term that I necessarily agree with, but for ease of understanding here and because of the data, I'm using that term. We've got 2.5% BA/ME female professors. And again, if we look at this pipeline, we see a growing gap. And then further, we look at heads of institutions. Again, we don't really need to look at the data to see what's around us in our everyday, in our working environments, in our learning environments. 94.8% heads of institutions are white, and 5.2% identify as Black, Asian and minority ethnic. And again, this is a further breaking down of the data of UK academics and what status they're at professorial level. So we've got professors versus non-professors, and that will vary depending on how your institution. So at the LSE, entry level is assistant professor. In other universities, it will be lecturer, senior lecturer, reader, and it's a slightly different model at the LSE. But again, this is representing a collective here. And again, I'm sure many of you are now familiar with this data. For those of you that are not, the student attainment across ethnic groups, this has been a long conversation that's been happening for many years now, and there's been lots of research into the experiences of students that are racialized. So we see here that 86% of white students are more likely to be awarded a first class or a 2-1 degree versus 66% of Black students. And this will vary across institutions, but it's still a gap. And what I found really interesting here that Advanced HE have done is the awarding gap between students whose parents had a higher education qualification and those who did not. I know that the OFS are now really keen to look at socioeconomic status, and we at the LSE have been really trying to work out what does it look like? How do we define socioeconomic status? And I think it's a really interesting presentation of the data. So that's the story in numbers, okay? So we've got EDI policies, we've got widening participation policies, we've got local level policies. Each institution will have, I'm sure many of you will have strategies in your institutions. We certainly do at the LSE. But is there a culture of diversity, or is there a culture of value in diversity? And this was a quote, well, it's a tweet actually by Barna Hayser that he put out in 2020. And this sort of was just after many universities were putting out statements around Black Lives Matter. And I've used this in a recent paper because I think it strikes a chord with me. Diversity becomes a rabbit hole when it's pursued as an alternative to anti-racism, when it glosses over racial hierarchy and racial segregation, when it fails to challenge white supremacy, when it is simply there to enhance the boutique experience of the white consumer. And I really kind of want you to think about that, given what I've said so far. Now, I'm a geographer by training, so like the idea of space is really important to me. But one thing from my own experience and the research that I've done and the role that I'm in now is this idea of these as universities as liberal spaces, as spaces where we create knowledge, we create research, they're liberal spaces, but actually they're quite unwelcoming spaces. And Robbie Shilliam wrote a piece in 2015 as part of the Runnymede Trust project that was authored by Jason Arde and Claire Alexandra. He's written a piece in that. And again, I strongly urge you to read that document if you haven't done so. He says, universities remain overwhelmingly, administratively, normatively, habitually, and intellectually white. The doors have been opened, but the architecture remains the same. And again, Divya Tolya-Kelly, a geographer, also has written about her own experiences of being in the university and the felt violences that are part of the everyday life of our students, researchers, and academic colleagues within institutions. This is not a new phenomenon. And then many of you will know Sara Ahmed's work, and Sara Ahmed gave a talk just sort of after the first lockdown, and she was using this idea of the door that I found really powerful. And so doors tell us how institutions function, for whom they function, how only some are allowed to enter, how others become trespassers. So again, I really kind of want you to think about the space and the policies that we have in place for people to come to university, even recruitment policies that we think about to diversify the student body, to diversify the staff body. But what about the people that embody that diversity? What about people like me, people like my colleagues that have done this work as well? So Sara Ahmed's work, Kalwant Bhopal's work, Nicola Rollock's work. You know, when I've spoken to sort of early career researchers, early career academics and students, you know, these are just some quotes from some research that I did. I have learned that the university may want my colour, but not my voice. The university may open itself to diverse students, but there is an expectation that we will be grateful, quiet, and maintain the university image. Another quote is, diversity, I do not make anyone uncomfortable by taking up more space than necessary. And again, so I really kind of carry on reading. It strikes a chord because we've got these policies, we've got practice. We also have a positive experience for some students. It's not to say that everyone's having a negative experience. But how does it feel once you enter into these spaces? Okay, what picture do we paint? So between 2017 and 2020, I did quite a long research project, which involves 3 different methods of in-depth interviewing, focus groups, and photo voice. And the focus was on PGT, PGR, and staff, mainly early career staff in universities. And really wanted to look at the sort of using photo voice enabled me to gain access to the spaces and for it to be a continuous piece of work. And some of you may have seen some of these images already from a paper that I've already published, but this is one image, and this is an image of a security guard, of a black male security guard in a corridor. And this is from a PhD student at the time. And he writes, dreams of possession. At all times, it appears that people like me are propping up the institution of which they should be part of. Even when we are inside, we are outside. Fanon tells us that the look that the native turns on the settler's town is a look of lust, a look of envy. It expresses his dreams of possession, all manner of possession. To sit at the settler's table, to sleep in the settler's bed with his wife if possible. The colonized man is an envious man, and the settler knows very well. When their glances meet, he ascertains bitterly, always on the defensive. They want to take our place. It is true, for there is no native who does not dream at least once, one day, of setting up himself at the settler's place. Another image that many of the students took and photographed was of the cleaning staff, and the image that I have here is of the cleaner's cart. And certainly at the LSE, you may miss the cleaners unless you're in very early in the morning. And one of the students wrote this very powerful narrative alongside this image. I'm going to leave this up for you to read for a moment. I'm not going to read it out, but it really does hit home this idea of charter marks, of targets that we have to meet, and it takes it to a whole other level. So I'm just going to leave it here for you lot to read. And again, this was a really common theme for quite a few students that were in the focus group and took part in the Photo Voice project. Their institutions were applying for their race equality charter marks. And it was a case that the charter mark would have given the institution a stamp of approval that it was racially equitable, but for many of the students, it was about maintaining a particular image. Another image that was quite common is this idea of the walls that surround, particularly at the older universities, when you go into the dining rooms or into the libraries, you see paintings of previous directors, of previous pro-vice chancellors. And again, that is like the whiteness in the walls that surround us always. I'm just going to stop presenting and pause for a moment because it's quite a lot to take in. I can't actually see the chat at all, Tracy, so I have no idea of any questions, but I just thought it'd be quite because it's a lot to take in at that point, and it's quite a lot of data and it's quite overwhelming. So if anybody has any questions at this point, that'd be really great.
So I can't see any questions at the moment, but we will, we can pause and we can ask if anyone wants to ask anything. And apologies, I have builders next door, so they've just started banging. So if anyone wants to put your hand up or ask a question, you're more than welcome to do that. Yeah, so Belinda has just asked there, I've used this myself in research. I'm a big fan of Photo Voice. So just as a method, can you just talk a little bit more about that, please?
Yeah, absolutely. I've used Photo Voice a few times. I mean, many years ago, it was called Photo Diaries. And it's a really great way of getting into the world of your participant, and it's been quite continuous. So what we did is we had a session with the students first. We did a focus group initially, where we asked a series of questions around the research. Then we used the themes from that focus group to sort of discuss what kind of images students would take, and use those themes from the focus group to narrate to the students, well, if you could frame your photographs around these, but they weren't limited, if that makes sense, but you have to guide your students. And we spent a lot of time with them, sort of how to take a photograph, and there's lots of videos that we used. There was an organisation called photovoice.org, and I'd gone along for a course with them, and they'd sort of taught me how to use the camera to frame, because it's all about framing as well, and who is viewing that photo. So the students were then given cameras, those that didn't have any cameras. I mean, most of them had phones that they used anyway, but quite a lot of them chose to use quite sophisticated cameras. And they were given 3 weeks to photograph their racialized experiences of campus and beyond if they wanted to as well. And then we regrouped with the photographs, and then they all presented their images back to us collectively, talked us through them, and then we actually had an exhibition afterwards as well. It's a really great method. It's powerful, but it's also it exposes you as a participant, as an individual, your feelings. But it's a really great way, particularly if you're looking at things like kind of race and racism in an institution and how a space can make that. We talk about belonging so much in the student body. How do we kind of envision that? And that was done through Photo Voice. So I really recommend it. There's so much literature out there. I mean, previously, you'll know, Tracy, if you've used this before, it was really kind of participatory action research. People were using Photo Voice. So yeah, I really recommend it.
Yeah, we did the same. It was actually on Spaces as well. It was learning spaces with secondary school students many years ago, and it was disposable cameras. So, you know, before mobile phones. And what was interesting about that, when they came back, you have to actually, you get a real sense of the wider family, because a lot of they went into their home personal spaces and things like that. So we had to kind of make decisions around what do you feel safe to actually share with the wider audience outside of this kind of safe group, and have lots of conversations around what that meant and how they were going to present their work and you know, things like that. So I used it with PAR as well, participatory action research. So it's a really nice method. So I'm just seeing yeah, people are really happy, just wanting to know more about it. I'm feeling slow progress and inclusion is still a progress. Any thoughts on that? Because of course EDI is so big, and I feel everyone is putting everything under EDI. And then of course, you know, I think now people are kind of seeing it more as, well, it's too much now, I'm getting a bit overwhelmed. So there's a couple of things there. And then another question was, with the obvious white dominance in HEIs, what ways can we challenge current mechanisms that don't allow the voice of our students to be heard? It's an interesting one.
Yeah, and I think it's actually flipping that, in that it's not that the voices aren't heard, that people are choosing not to listen sometimes, or hearing it in a particular way. And I agree, this idea of how do we include, it's almost difficult to even say, well, what are we being included into, right? And it's that structure, like, you don't want to be included, you want to be part of it. And it's so difficult. I think hearing, it's actually quite easy sometimes. I say, you know, in this role, it's about seeing and valuing your students, who's in your classroom, seeing them, valuing what they're saying. And it's not a case of, I'm going to diversify my curriculum and then that's it. It's much bigger than that. And we also have to acknowledge, and I say this so often, and others have said this before me, universities are really powerful places. We create knowledge, we create research. It's not just applying this work to our teaching, but it's applying it to our research practice as well. And I think sometimes that is missed. And so we need to bring those all together and acknowledge all of that. And that's part of the decolonizing process, is sort of stripping back and starting again.
That's the importance, isn't it, around, it's not just academics, actually. It's, you know, yes, it's the teaching learning space. It's how we encourage our learners to learn outside of the physical space, you know, in our virtual spaces, in our libraries, in our cafeterias, you know, everywhere, and our administrative staff and everything. And it's people using that kind of shared language and terminology that's really important.
Great. I'm going to move on to my next set of slides, because that comes really nicely and may answer some of your questions. Okay, go forward again. So I'm going to sound like LSE is the greatest place ever here, but this is mainly because it's my work and my colleagues, who some of them are actually in the room today. So what I've tried really hard to do in my current role is to really encourage the LSE to take a whole school approach. And I think this was something that one of the speakers touched on when they were talking about student partnership and student voice and well-being. It's about moving beyond those targets and highlighting other proxies for attainment. I think whilst it's important that those grade awarding gaps are eliminated, we also have to acknowledge that students can come to university from diverse backgrounds, get really high grades, but there's huge consequences for having to fit yourself into those structures. And I know that from my own personal experience. We have to centre race, and that means encountering discomfort Some of what I'm saying today may be uncomfortable for some people, but it's working through that discomfort. It's also recognizing that there are student identities, not just a student identity, and that will change and transform as students go through their journey in higher education. And it's also about raising consciousness. And it's not something that you go along to a workshop and you're done and dusted with. So we have what we've called the Inclusive Education Action Plan, and there are 5 areas of work in that. The first one focuses on academic mentoring. And what we've really tried to do with this plan is to say, right, we are trying to induct, we don't want to induct what is deemed different into these established dominant structures, as I've said previously, but we want the structures to start to change, right, and rebuild, and that will take time. But academic mentoring, and some of you may, many universities call this personal tutoring, but LSE is called academic mentoring, is such an important part of the student experience and the student journey. And it really is a really central part if we want to encourage students, particularly racialized students, to go on and do PhDs. The relationship, that scholarly relationship that you have with your students. Sometimes the focus becomes on pastoral care and supporting students. And yes, that's incredibly important. But sometimes students just want to talk about what interests them, what they're curious about. And I think we really have to centre that. The second area looks at curriculum enhancement. And what we've done in that is that we're kind of looking at course aims and content and outcomes, and we've stripped that into 2 different areas of diversifying and decolonising, because I professionally and personally don't believe any institution is quite ready yet to decolonise, and we shouldn't sort of have this theatre of decolonising. It has to be true decolonising. And we've sort of defined diversification around kind of looking at a global and varied perspective in your course content. And the purpose of that diversification is to make visible the perspectives and identities often marginalised. And it also involves developing the canon further. I think sometimes people think we can't take away the canon, but we're not asking anyone to take away the canons in their schools of thought. It's about how they're used and how we can develop them further. And then we're really focusing on decolonising epistemologies and its process of critical thinking and challenging Eurocentric modes of thinking, which are linked to colonialism. And acknowledging that actually knowledge itself is colonised. It isn't simply a case, and we found this as we've kind of been doing our work at the LSE, that adding scholars from the global south isn't decolonising, because a lot of the schools of thought, a lot of institutions in the global south are also Western and Westernised universities. So we really have to be careful about how we use decolonising. The third area of work is around inclusive pedagogies. And again, as I said, it's not about embedding students into systems which excludes them from the onset, but rather kind of transforming and democratizing our pedagogies. The fourth area of work is actually a research project that will be ongoing around developing higher education identities. And we've been carrying out research with first, second and third year undergraduates, doing, again, something really in-depth with diaries with students, interviews, because we really want to think about how do we have a continuous kind of induction process for first years, for second years and third years. What happens to students in their identities in the first years? How are they building relationships? How are they finding what sparks their curiosity through research? What skills? And it's not a stop and start research project, but we'll continually do this work. And the final area of the plan is building and developing anti-racism. And so I'm just going to talk you through some brief work. So at the LSE, we've done some research into academic mentoring and how students experience, how academic mentors feel about mentoring as well, because again, we mustn't forget it's a really stressful job to mentor students and to do this work. And it shouldn't just fall on the academic identified mentors. It's all of the school, it's all of the teaching staff that engage with students should be part of this. We have an academic mentoring community of practice that meets fortnightly. We've developed academic mentoring principles, which build on what we have as the academic code, but slightly more informal. We have reflective sessions for mentors that's been run by our counselling service. We run sessions we're entitled Caring or Crisis Management, what is academic mentoring? And we continuously want to do research into this area because it's changing all the time. The student body is changing, their needs are changing. And curriculum enhancement, we're established principles around diversifying and what it means to diversify. we are acknowledging the difference between quantitative and qualitative, which is really important at the LSE. And I'm certainly guilty of centering my comfort in qualitative work. So it's important that we think about curriculum and diversification of a curriculum for quantitative subjects. We've got something called change makers, which are student-led projects, which are calls to actions. And we've appointed what we've called attainment leads across all of the undergraduate departments. Now, the attainment leads are really important in that they are the people in the departments that will lead the improvements through the Inclusive Education Action Plan. So I've just noticed the typo, apologies. They disseminate the relevant data and good practice. They support their staff in achieving and creation of this inclusive education. And they consult with staff and students when necessary to carry out research. Again, we have to be really careful. It's something that I haven't spoken about yet. But over-research of students, particularly around our racialised students or our non-traditional students as well, we know what's going on and we know the problems in our institutions. Continuously doing research with our students and presenting that as the solution is really not making any change. It's a lot of labour. It's a lot of trauma for students as well to constantly talk about their experiences. And the attainment leads also work closely with me. So the key here is to have a point of contact in the departments. Around decolonising, we really kind of want to reverse the gaze, as I've said before, and go beyond this decolonising theatre. So we're working with departments. We've got a seminar series. We've just launched and appointed fellowships in decolonising across different departments. And what that is doing is encouraging people in their own disciplines to work through what would decolonising look like in sociology, in social policy, for geography, because it's very, very different. And I think some of it we have to do a little bit of intellectual work to then get to the practicalities of it, particularly in a place like the LSE where research is really, really important. And again, inclusive pedagogies is around dismantling these dominant structures. The ground clearing practices I discussed earlier are part and parcel of what we deliver. Engaging in difficult dialogue, this is a really important piece of work. Sometimes it's difficult to have these conversations in the classroom. Netiquette guidance, again, the shift online has changed things so much. And I think it's a really good time now to move beyond that emergency response that we all had in the pandemic to really thinking about how can we make inclusive, equitable spaces online. We've just recently launched something called the Inclusive Education Mapping Exercise, which is built on, some of you may have seen the UCL Curriculum Health Check. I wanted to develop something, again, that was this continuum and reflective and is asking people, whatever journey they are on in education, around inclusion, around diversity, decolonising race, to be able to reflect on their practice and to seek support and collaborate. We've got a student education panel that is run by one of my colleagues, our student education partnership coordinator. We've co-facilitated sessions with them. We also have a fantastic blog called the LSE Higher Education blog, which is also full of resources for both LSE and external. Please do take a look. And then the final bit is building knowledge to enable change. And as uncomfortable as it may make people to talk about race and anti-racism, I'm really pleased that we've been able to centre race in our conversation in this work. And so I've been running a series of workshops with academic staff and professional staff around anti-racism. So it's a series of 6 sessions that ideally you would attend all of them, but we look at anti-racism in higher education, whiteness in the academy, diversity and higher education, anti-racist pedagogy, inclusive curriculum, and race and disability in the academy. I think it's really important that we create those spaces for staff to be able to ask questions. As I said before, not everyone is at the same stage, and that's okay. It's bringing people on the journey with you, and you know, all of us are learning. You know, I don't have all the answers. We don't all know what the answer to some of these questions are. And it's about continuously kind of making sure that we are educating one another and sharing knowledge and sharing some vulnerabilities as well. We've also launched a series very recently of ableism in the academy as well. And that again is around rephrasing and reframing disability, going beyond inclusion plans, And again, looking at the online world, sometimes people will assume that online means it's inclusive and accessible, and that's not necessarily the case just because it's online. So that's sort of some of the work that we're doing at the LSE. I've sort of done a whistle-stop tour of it, but I'm really proud of the work that we're doing, and welcome any questions. It'd be great to hear what other universities are doing as well. So thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Akile. I'm sure everybody agrees that that was very riveting, and some, highlights some of the great work that you're doing at LSE. If anybody wants to, because we have a few minutes before we pause before our second set of sessions, so you're more than welcome to unmute yourself, raise your hand, and you ask a direct question yourself. I think I asked most of the questions. There was one question there, and I think I actually asked a question as well. What are your thoughts around reverse mentoring? And if you do that at LSE, or if you've had any feedback from that, because we are actively trying to do that or get that off the ground in QUB, without much success, to be honest, for many obvious reasons, for exactly the people that are, I suppose, often over burdened and often asked to do more, and without really knowing what they're going to get out of this. But I suppose that, people feel that this would be, it's been piloted, but it hasn't gone off the ground yet. I'm just wondering, have you ever tried it, or know anybody, other institution that does it?
So we haven't tried it, but I know that there are some institutions. I can't remember off the top of my head which ones, but we're yet to do that, Tracy, because I don't think we've actually got the mentoring right just yet, let alone the sort of reverse mentoring, I think. So I'll be really interested to hear if other people in the room have any experience of reverse mentoring as well.
Yeah, great. If you do, you can either write in the comments, or you can put your hand up and ask a question. That'd be great. Tahir asked, do you think that seeing diversified staff can be a sort of long-term establishment of better student inclusion?
That is a really good question. And I'd say yes, it matters so much. And I hadn't realised how much it mattered until I was working at Middlesex a couple of years ago as a senior lecturer, and I had students that would come up to me and just thank me for being in the room, for doing a PhD, and for being at the front and saying, I never thought I'd see someone that looks like me, sounds like he's from the same part of the world as me, and it means so much, and it's making me want to pursue this work. So definitely. But the other side of it is so difficult to be in the university, to be a person of colour, and I think the universities need to do more. As I've said, if we look at those numbers, the pathway up is non-existent for some of us. The pay gaps, if we're not even thinking about pay, but just the lived experiences and the trauma. Universities have to start, acknowledging that and looking after staff and caring for staff and promoting staff. It's not just about bringing in and hiring Black professors, for example. It's about promoting the Black staff that are already in the institution, supporting their promotions, valuing teaching and learning, and valuing things like mentoring, Tracy. You realise some of this work doesn't count towards promotions, right? All of the soft skills that we give and are really important to some of us, they're not promotable. So the institution has to really change its culture, but 100% agree. It would have changed my experience if I saw someone that looked like me and sounded like me. It would have made my PhD experience, for example, so much easier.
Yeah, and you just made a really nice point there, Akile, about the more you give and the more of your personal self that you give around student support or mentorship or whatever. And as you said, it's not always recognized. And actually the people who do that are the people who give the most. And actually it's a huge amount of, like, maybe even sharing your own trauma or your own lived experience. And that can be exhausting. And the hours that takes, you know, to do that, and you might often be doing it in the evenings even, and outside of work hours. So I absolutely agree there. Jen McParland, my friend, hello Jen, said there is a lot of well-intended talk in higher ed about belonging, but doesn't it assume that everyone wants to belong? Isn't it possible that you might not choose to belong to an institution based on its values, its decisions, its actions, etc.? So is mattering a better term than belonging? I've heard this actually a few times recently. People are, I mean, if we keep shifting terms, I don't know where we're going to end up, but a lot of people are talking about that difference now of the term of belonging versus mattering.
Yeah, no, I agree. I was at a talk a couple of years ago, and I can't remember who said it now. My COVID brain is pretty bad, I'm afraid. But they shifted it and said it's not about belonging, but it's about the university belonging to us. And so actually shifting the way it's framed, because you're right, not everybody wants to belong, and everyone comes to university for different reasons. And students will come in, get their head down to get the degrees that they want to get. And then want to move on and get a job. They don't really want to be part of the fabric or part of anything, really, because it's too difficult. But I hadn't heard that around mattering. It's a really good point, yeah.
So again, if anyone wants to unmute or put your hand up to ask a question, we have another few minutes. Sometimes people are a little bit shy at the beginning, so we can, but there's plenty of people in the room, so I'm sure you can, you know, there's about 53 people in the room, so please do ask a question. And how, just I'll ask you a question there while we're just waiting, Akile. So for me, you know, around diversifying the curriculum and decolonizing the curriculum, and people, you know, are kind of that comfort of I'll go first and try to kind of focus around diversifying. And you even called out in your slides around, you know, we need to really shift and move beyond this diversifying the reading list, and where, as you said, where we're drawing our knowledge from. And yes, we're increasing our international staff all the time, and they, you know, whether that they come from a traditional kind of education setting, you know, the process of how they're taught, and bringing that knowledge. But again, it can often be that westernized kind of where they're drawing their knowledge from. So what kind of sense are you getting from your own staff at LSE around the difference between diversifying and decolonizing, and how deep have you actually got? Because, you know, we have tried to do a number of seminars, a number of talks, and there are staff that are actively trying to make small changes. But for me, you know, we can't put that onus on, you know, only an individual, because if we're not decolonizing the curriculum, you know, we have to decolonize the institution as well as decolonize the curriculum. So they can't kind of happen separate. They kind of need to be happen in sync. And I feel in many sense personally that, you know, in terms of leadership and driving that conversation, it's really important to see who is driving it, or if anybody is driving that conversation. Just like to hear your thoughts on that.
No, I agree with you, Tracy. It's been really interesting at the LSE in that I've sort of encouraged staff to start with diversifying and thinking about what that means, and thinking about, like you say, their reading lists, because although we might think, oh, it's a really easy thing and we'll just do that, it's really difficult. And to get people to start changing reading lists or developing their reading lists, you get a lot of resistance. And I understand, I would feel the same if someone was telling me, well, your reading list is not good enough. So we've had quite a few departments do an audit of what they've got currently, and, you know, people will find that it's 70% white European North American literature that they tend to be quoting and using, and the difference between kind of like your main reading list versus, you know, recommended readings. And so we've really got people to develop some principles, like how would you kind of unpack your reading list? How would you do a coding exercise of kind of gender, ethnicity, race, where in the world you're taking your literature from, at what point in time? And that's been working really well. We've had really good kind of engagement from staff, from students. There's been a lot of staff-student partnership in that, where staff are bringing in students to do the work with them. and establishing principles and definitions and methodologies of how they do these audits, because the methods you employ are really important and you have to be quite consistent. We're quite lucky at LSE because it's predominantly social sciences. So we started with that, Tracy, because I think, as I said, you'd have to strip apart the whole institution to get to decolonising. I was at a talk a couple of months ago where they said you'd have to burn the whole place down and start again. And we can't burn the whole place down and start again. But we can be a bit more upfront about our histories and where our institutions have come from and what they were founded on. And then start talking about, and that is in our disciplines as well, as a geographer, it's an inherently, colonial subject, and it's that relationship as well. I've had a lot of discussion around decolonising, post-colonialism, where does this all fit in together for the different disciplines. But we've had really great projects that have worked really well around diversifying of the reading lists. And what we're trying to do in the next stage of it is actually using this concept of difficult dialogue in having conversations and presenting the reading list back to staff, to students, and getting to kind of get them understand how it can make some people feel. If you're solely concentrating on only 5 countries in the entire world, well, that's not a global reading list, is it? It's that idea of the global. What does that look like? Who are we including in all of that? So I hope I've answered your question. I'm not sure I have, actually. Have I?
Yeah, I think it's really, you kind of said it at the very beginning that it's a continuum. There's no right or wrong starting point. There's no right or wrong finish point. And actually, there isn't a finish point, because if you think about how much our learner how diverse our learners have become, and are continuously shifting. And now with the war in Ukraine, we're going to have a lot of estranged children. We're going to have a lot of, people being displaced and things. So, our schools are opening up to young children, which in turn, in a few years, they won't all go back to the Ukraine and stuff. So we really have to be thinking about that moving forward. But as you say, there isn't a right or wrong. There isn't a start and an end. It'll be wherever you are, depending on the context. Because here in Northern Ireland, of course, we're very unique in our own context, and I suppose the term decolonizing has, even more. It has a different sense to somebody living in mainland UK, as they do in Northern Ireland. So I think that's always a conversation that comes up as well. Jenny asked about, you mentioned the 6 sessions with colleagues to explore racism in higher education. She's just wondering what the subject areas were, what the themes were, and was it a continuous theme threaded throughout the sessions, or were they separate themes?
So what we did with the sessions is I ran them all, and ideally you would have attended all of them and built up your knowledge bank, right? And then what we were trying to do is, the themes were all, as I said, those were the titles of each of the sessions, and some of what I've delivered here today is part of some of that work that I facilitate at the LSE. It's very much using all of the data that LSE has collected over the last 10 years. We've had so many kind of student projects, focus groups, my research, my colleague Sarah Camacho Felix has done research on the student experience, and bringing all of that into one place. And you can't dispute when you say this is data about your own institution, this is data about your own department, these are the experiences of your students. It isn't something that's happening elsewhere. So we've really tried to highlight that, and then give people the tools to talk about race, right? And understand, sort of, to talk about race is not necessarily to talk about decolonizing. They're not one in the same. And to start to remove the discomfort, okay? Because a lot of the work around diversification is about centering white comfort, and we tried really hard through these centres to decenter that, and for people to be able to go back to their departments and then do the work themselves, rather than us. I could go into a department and run a session, but these were open to everybody across the school, and people from professors to professional staff that are also part of teaching, to people in careers were coming along, and how they used the information that we gave was entirely up to them. But we were really trying to that kind of train the trainer model. I'm really keen to be able to give people the tools to go back to their departments and then do the work themselves, because I think that is far more powerful than any conference, any external facilitator coming in can do. And it's it's that idea, we said, that building it into our structures, and that involves everybody. So yeah, I mean, maybe one day we'll open up those sessions to external people, but at the moment they're only for LSE staff. So
yeah, that's fair enough. We have done a couple of things, opened it up external, and other areas where we just wanted to give people a safer space to make it more kind of internal. And I think that working on both of those is kind of important, I suppose. I do have actually a resource I pulled together in a Padlet on decolonizing. It covers all different disciplines and things. So I'll try to, throughout the session, pull that out in a second, and I'll put it in the chat for people if they want it. So I still don't see any hands up. A lot of people, so I see Verna's in here as well. Hi, Verna. Such important work, keep it going. She used to head off. And sounds like very valuable work. So a lot of people saying thank you. You do have some references and whatnot in your slides, and we can pull those out later on, because Ben was asking any particular books or papers to get you started on decolonizing. And of course, it's like diversifying the curriculum. It's like anti-racism pedagogy, that they are slightly separate, but there are of course overlaps as well. And they're all focusing on different kind of things. So yeah, no, that's it. I think we're at 55 minutes. So I want to try to, I suppose, pause and give people a bit of a break between two sessions. So all the thank yous and whatnot will come in. So it's been a riveting talk, Akile, and I do really appreciate your time. And I'm sure from everybody in the room, they all want to say thank you, and you can give in your reactions a kind of an applause. Thanks very much. So I'm just going to pause there, and Ben will put back up the slide with the music. And just want to say thank you very much for being part of our conference. And everyone who's going to stay on, just make sure you keep engaging in the chat. So I just want to say thank you very much from everyone in QUB.
Thank you so much, Tracy, and everyone for coming along and listening. Thank you.
Thanks very much. Okay, so welcome back everyone, or anyone that has just joined us. So we're going to go on to the second part of our session under the theme EDI. And first up, I am going to introduce Dr. Nicholas Spowski, Mr. David Hall, Miss Lucy Hutchinson, and Miss Melody Harrogate. And they are from the University of Derby. And I'm absolutely delighted. So each session is going to be 15 minutes. So if you want to just start uploading your slides there and getting organized. And the title of this presentation is Belonging Enough? So it might actually continue that conversation. There was a question in the first hour. So is belonging enough? Nostalgia, mattering and belonging as a framework for inclusive online practice in the pandemic. Absolutely delighted to have you and welcome you here to QUB, Nicholas. So if you just want to get organized there, and if you need any assistance, just ask.
Yeah, thank you very much.
I'll keep an eye on
those. Can you see that slides?
Something's coming through here now. Sometimes it's a bit slow, so yep, I see you. See, that's perfect. Okay, I'll keep an eye on the time.
You see the title slide?
Yep, perfect.
All right then, that's great. Well, thank you for to Akila for the last presentation. There was a lot of food for thought in there, and a lot that maybe connects with this short presentation that I'm giving on behalf of a group of us in the Institute of Education at the University of Derby online. I'm Nicholas Boskill, and I'm doing this on behalf of David Hall, Lucy Hutchinson, and Melody Harrogate. And we're really asking the question, is belonging enough? There's so much that's said and written about this concept of belonging. Has it become meaningless, or is it focused, and is it enough on its own anyway? We're looking at nostalgia, mattering and belonging as a framework for inclusive online practice, and specifically focusing this talk on the first wave of the pandemic. I'm hoping you can see the change of slide there. This work comes from the research that we did during the first wave of the pandemic. This is an online Masters in Education that we deliver at the University of Derby. And the participants in this Masters programme are all practicing teachers around the world. So the teachers, the participants are in Europe, Asia, Africa, South America, and sometimes North America. And they are in different sectors of education, mainly schools, but secondary, primary, some private sector. And as part of our research, we were interested in exploring different experiences of the first wave of the pandemic and the technology that they used. And we interviewed 28 of the program participants. This comes from a particular module called Innovative 21st Century Teaching, a look at the use of technology for learning and teaching. And that module became very much more of interest, shall we say, much more authentic learning in that first wave. So the participants were particularly engaged in this module. We asked them how they coped as a school and individually with the sudden move online. And the model that I'm going to show you from this research is drawn from just two participants in these 28 interviews. And they were of interest as special cases in some respects, because they said that their schools coped quite well, indeed very well, with the sudden change to the online setting. So we were particularly interested to find out, well, you know, what did they do that made them feel so happy, if you like, with the way they coped with that change? How did they use the technology? That first wave was one of the research questions. And what was the emotional response, the reaction, if you like, to the uses of their technology during that first wave? So there were three particular ways in which they used the technology, which are not particularly surprising to anybody. I don't think I'm interested in introducing you to anything earth-shattering, but there were three particular ways in which they used the technology, and this is the first one. They used the technology to make everybody's experience as flexible as possible. And to give you some idea, incidentally, the two cases, one was in the UK and the other was in China. So it's quite interesting that they were, you know, very far apart as well. But anyway, for instance, when teachers met with senior management in the schools, it had traditionally been at straight after teaching had finished. They were then called to the office, and when they were tired and exhausted from the day's teaching, they were then having to have those meetings. With the introduction of the technology during the first wave, they were able to take a break and possibly to get something to eat or have a rest or whatever, and then to organize the meetings. And when the school returned to the physical classroom, they continued that practice afterwards because it was so popular and so humane, as it were. Obviously, there was flexibility for the students in using the materials that were then provided for them. And the school also organised an annual school conference online in which the participants could engage with that conference flexibly. So all of these things that had previously been set times and at particular places changed as a consequence of the pandemic and made everybody's experience more flexible. So that was one way in which the technology was used, if you like. The other was that the technology made things more communal. If you like, it grouped people much more. It made them aware of what we might call entitativity, a sense of groupness. And this came about through the collaboration that was necessitated by working from home. But suddenly teachers were contributing to the ability of the school to deliver a conference. Teachers were pooling ideas in a shared online space, creating training materials for each other. They were using WeChat to discuss and notify each other of these materials and how they went, how well they went when they were implemented. Suddenly, departments were collaborating to create materials cross-disciplinary. For example, music, art, and drama were traditionally teaching their classes separately, and ne'er the twain would meet. But suddenly now they were collaborating to produce learning materials for art, which contained aspects of all these different fields. And the heads were scrapping newsletters and making video newsletters, if you like, videos for parents. And also the parents, relatives and carers suddenly had access to lesson content. So the digital materials produced by the teachers were not only delivered to the learners, but also were used and caused a degree of interest and engagement from the parents, relatives and carers. So this whole use of technology combined to make the experience communal. And the third way in which technology was used or experienced was that the practice became suddenly visible. So whereas they were traditionally in their classrooms delivering their lessons and off they would go, suddenly all this digital content was being produced and shared across the school and across the community with parents and carers and so on. And this practice suddenly became much more visible. Teachers were able to see the materials produced by their colleagues, and they were able to identify good practice and adopt and learn from each other that way, in ways that were much more difficult otherwise. And likewise, managers suddenly had a sense of institutional practice that they had not previously had. So that was making this practice as a school and as individuals much more visible to one another. So having identified these three ways in which these schools were using technology, we were then interested to look, and particularly here we're looking at a school level approach, an institutional level approach, rather than individual use of technology. And we were interested then to explore the data and to see what the kind of effects of these uses of technology was. And we then tried to map these emotional responses onto these uses of technology through our analysis. So what we found was that the use of technology to make things more flexible for people seems to have caused people to feel as though others cared about them, as though suddenly they mattered. And by mattering, we mean a sense that we are valued by others or that we add value to others. People felt that somebody actually cared and that they actually mattered in the process. And it is possible to feel that you feel a sense of belonging without feeling that you matter. So, you know, when we were talking earlier in the previous session about distinctions between mattering and belonging, belonging is a sense of group membership, a sense of belonging and sharing the norms of a group. Whereas mattering is that sense of having value, either being valued by others or that we add value. And this is one consequence then of the technology making experience flexible. We found that because technology made their experiences communal and it developed a sense of entitativity, a sense of groupness, if you like, that participants in the school, parents, carers, teachers, and learners, had a greater sense of belonging, a greater sense of what they were belonging to, this entitativity. It became you know, much clearer, and they were contributors to it. They were engaged with it, producing and sharing these materials and making for a communal experience through the collaboration. And finally, that this making this experience visible, this experience of this very unpredictable and very scary and something that they'd not previously experienced, doing this together and it becoming so visible to them induced a sense of nostalgia. It was a yearning, if you like, for the sense of togetherness generated and made visible through the digital interaction. And so our speculation, and it is only speculation, we're still working on the data and we're still looking at ways of developing this work, is that this combination, rather than this idea of is belonging enough, this combination of belonging and mattering and nostalgia, each interact, possibly we suggest, to create a sense of institutional well-being through this use of these uses of technology, making flexibility, communal sense of togetherness, and making all of this visible, creating this archive as well that they still use, interestingly, having returned to the school. And so we're offering this as our,
just so you know.
Yeah. So this is our model of emotional good practice for institutions. In other words, we're suggesting if you use this combination of technologies in these ways, it may give rise to these positive aspects and contribute to institutional well-being. So this is our emotional model of good practice. There is a health warning. It's 2 cases. They're not even representative of the sample. They're certainly not representative of the module or of the wider world. They're the only cases that reported nostalgia at all. And we're still developing the model and looking at an agenda for further research. So the question for you to consider, perhaps, now or later, is whether any of this has any resonance for yourselves, either during the first wave of the pandemic or in your use institutionally of technology. Thank you very much.
Nicholas, thanks very much for that. And I suppose Jen must have set up that question really nicely there in terms of the difference between belonging and mattering. And we had just started that conversation, so it was really nice kind of followed through for that. So Nicholas, if you can hang around a little bit for the end, that we'll keep all the questions. Yeah. So just as you reflect on the talk there, our next speakers will start to come in. And start uploading their slides. And I do apologize, but I had to actually leave the room for a second because my Mac went a little bit mental and I had to get on another platform and another laptop really quickly. So I do apologize for that. So we're just going to we have 3 more speakers here, and now I don't actually have it in front of me, so I'm going to read this out. Sorry. So the title is Introducing Cultural Humility in the Medical Curriculum. And our speakers are going to come online there a second. So you just have to give me a second. So I know we have Grania, we have Dee, we have Mairead, and Ariana, Asha. So thank you very much. So really looking forward to hearing this, and I'll keep an eye on the time. And when I turn on the camera, it'll be 2 minutes, if that's okay. Thanks very much.
Yes. Thank you very much, Tracy. So yes, my name is Grania Kearney. I'm a clinical lecturer and an academic GP in the Centre for Medical Education, and my pronouns are she and her. So I'm going to begin this presentation this afternoon, and we're delighted to be involved in this conference. I've learned so much already just from being here from 2 o'clock, so thank you very much. So our presentation is on introducing cultural humility in the medical curriculum, and this is something we introduced this academic year 21-22, and you'll meet the rest of the team through the presentation. So I lead a module in our medical school where first-year medical students enjoy early clinical contact with patients, usually in their own home, led by GP tutors in the community. This is not only a highlight of the medical degree here at Queen's University Belfast, but it's a formative experience that shapes the kind of doctor these students will be in the future, the point where they often come to understand patients as people. And I say that from personal experience, as I was a student in this module myself 20 years ago, and hopefully you can see here the report that I produced at that time. And I still often now reflect on this experience as a GP of almost 15 years. So for many students, this early clinical contact is their first experience of getting to know someone culturally different from them, taking culture in its broadest sense. So we saw an opportunity to develop this through the introduction of cultural humility in this module, embracing the idea of becoming the student of the patient, aligning with the call for inclusion in Strategy 2030 and equity in the Sustainable Developmental Goals. So I'm going to pass over now to Dr. Maria Corrigan, who's going to tell us a little bit more about cultural humility.
Okay, thanks, Grania. I'm Maria Corrigan. My pronouns are she, her, and I'm a senior lecturer and EDI lead in the Centre for Medical Education. So as Grania said, she approached me to discuss how to integrate diversity into the early clinical contact programme. So we agreed that it would be good to introduce students to the concept of cultural humility. And over the next 2 slides, I'm going to briefly explain what cultural humility is. So in their paper, Cultural Humility versus Cultural Competence, which was published in 1998, Melanie Tarallon and Jan Mary Garcia introduced the concept of cultural humility for training doctors to care for patients from diverse backgrounds. They developed it in response to the limitations of traditional cultural competence, which they criticised for encouraging doctors to learn objective facts about cultures, which can lead to stereotyping. The umbrella to the right illustrates how cultural humility doesn't just focus on race and ethnicity, but it incorporates individuals' multiple identities to include social class, sexual orientation, etc., all of which intersect to produce individual experiences. So, what are the main components of cultural humility? So on the left, the diagram shows these components. Cultural humility is a process of lifelong learning and self-reflection. It encourages us to self-reflect on our own cultural identities and our conscious and unconscious biases towards different racial and ethnic groups, different genders, sexual orientations, etc. So cultural humility also promotes redressing power imbalances and promoting mutual respectful partnerships between patients and doctors. So, for example, promoting patient-centered medical interviewing when patients are respected as being experts in their health, and also when doctors are humble enough to admit when they don't know something. For cultural humility to work, institutions also need to be accountable and to reflect on their own practices and whether their processes contradict what is taught. So, for example, while we teach our students to use interpreters, they may see family members being used instead in clinical practice. We also introduced students to the 5 R's of cultural humility, which, although this was developed for healthcare leaders, we felt that it was useful in guiding students to apply cultural humility to their patient encounters. And I'm going to very briefly explain each of the R's. So the first R, reflection, encourages students to reflect on what they learned from each person that they encounter. The second R, respect, encourages them to reflect whether they treated everyone with respect. For regard, they ask themselves whether any unconscious biases interfered with their interactions. They then reflect on the relevance of cultural humility to their interaction. And finally, they reflect on how their personal resiliency and global compassion were enhanced by the interaction. I'm now going to hand you over to Dee.
Thank you, Maria. My name is Dara Casement, but I always say to people that my name is Dee and my pronouns are she, her. So within this project, we created a video embedding cultural humility early in the curriculum. And in this video, the concept of cultural humility was explained to students and for the GP tutors who would be facilitating student learning. You can see a copy of the video or a screenshot of the video on this slide. So video as a medium allows for a personalised message. With presenters on screen, we were more likely to connect on an emotional level with the audience members when using video and webcam when compared to other content formats. And we know as a format, video is more engaging and leads to higher retention rates. For example, 90% of information is visual, and it is proven that visual content is processed much faster than the same information presented in a text format. Albeit making recordings are time consuming, it does take planning, coordination and discussion. However, as a process, it makes presenters consider the information to be shared with audiences within a defined time frame. And it is important that video content is as digitally accessible and inclusive as possible. This means providing audio for people who can hear and subtitles for those who are non-hearing. And in addition, we also provided transcripts. Studies have shown that 7.5 million people in the UK do use subtitles or captions on recordings and videos, but only 1.5 million of this group are actually deaf. Captions and subtitles are used mainly by non-deaf people, but they're also used by those where English is not their first language. And studies again have shown that subtitles really do help with specific terminology as well as local accents. Along with this, we know that video formats are preferred by learners as they can be watched at a pace to suit the individual learner. The use of webcam made the recordings more personal, and it showed the presenters directly addressing their audience. Again, studies have shown that by being more personal, students are more likely to engage. It was very important for us to use the QUB branding. It was also really important that the images used demonstrated a range of people within medicine for many different cultures and disciplines. Images were also sourced using Creative Commons licensing and/or personally captured images. And of course, the biggest advantage of video is that it can be used and reused, and there's no further cost to time or effort. Once the video was viewed, we carried out a mini workshop called Have You Ever? And we gave students a number of prompts over Mentimeter, again thinking of culture within its broadest sense. And students could respond anonymously and instantly to the statements that were presented. There were around 10 prompts, and we were careful about commenting on themes as to not bias student responses. I will now pass you over to Ariana.
Thank you, Dee. My name is Ariana Asha. I'm a third-year medical student, and my preferred pronouns are he, she, her. To allow continuity in students' learning experience of cultural humility, we got the GP tutors to talk about their contact with their patients using the 5 R's framework, once at the start of the module and again at the end. Finally, we asked students to reflect on this concept in their blogs, which they produce as part of the summative assessment for this module. Next slide. Following good teaching practices, we evaluated the students' learning using an initial survey just after the reflective exercise workshop and the introductory video they mentioned. From a total of 312 students, 188 responses were collected from this survey. Quantitative data measured students' understanding and perceived importance of cultural humility, as well as their level of preparedness in using cultural humility in clinical practice. Next slide. The mixed method approach we used also helped us to collect qualitative data about student experiences. The free text responses from surveys highlighted how students feel about their own experience with learning and practicing cultural humility. We have chosen 2 responses to illustrate, which I will now read. I am so glad to be doing cultural humility as part of our curriculum. If I'm being honest, one of the things I was worried about with coming to an ordinary Irish medical school was that there would be a lack of attention to issues of diversity in ethnicity, race, gender, and sexuality. I am not only thrilled to be part of a course that wants to produce socially conscious, kind, and sensitive doctors, but I feel very privileged and grateful that our teaching is deeply aligned with producing human-focused clinicians. Another first-year student added, I feel like cultural humility is a long overdue model to be adopted in medical schools, especially in the increasingly multicultural society we now live in. A number of issues can arise in medical practice as a result of the unconscious bias and stereotyping by medical professionals. Cultural humility should aid in alleviating these issues. We will also be using the blogs written up by medical students, as well as informal feedback from GP tutors on their role in introducing cultural humility into early clinical contact. These will ultimately enable us to provide better resources for students and more support for tutors. I will now hand over to Grania.
Okay, so we've been really pleased with how this initiative has been received by our students and GP tutors, and so we've been making some plans about how to further develop this. So we have ethical approval for research into this initiative. We've already talked about the surveys, collecting both quantitative and qualitative data, and also we have access to the blogs of some consenting students to analyse in more depth how they have tried to apply their learning on cultural humility to their early clinical contact with patients. In addition, we plan to extend this initiative into the third year of the medical curriculum. We hope to build on what they've learnt as they gain more clinical experience by developing the critical element of cultural humility to prompt these more senior medical students to consider the power differentials and how they play out in clinical relationships, something that we hope that they will continue to be aware of in the future when they are doctors consulting with people. So that brings us to the end of our presentation. Thank you for listening, and thank you for involving us today. And we will be taking questions, I understand, at the end.
Thanks very much for that, everyone. That was really great. And I think it's such an important area, and not just for our medical students, of course. It's something that definitely could be rolled out right across the institution. You know, in terms of that kind of like respecting, being aware of different intersectionality of identities and whatnot. So that's really good. Thanks very much. And I do apologize for the beginning there. My laptop crashed and I lost everything and had to switch for another laptop. So I had nothing in front of me. So I do apologize for not using full names and titles and whatnot. Thanks very much. So now we are on our final session, and we'll have a nice bit of time for questioning actually, which will be really nice. So our final speakers are also from Queen's University Belfast, and we have Dr. Stephanie Burns, Dr. Gulsali Besu, and who'll be here physically today, and also involved in the project was Dr. Lida Sena. So the title of their presentation is Examining Multicultural Education in Psychology in Higher Education. And Stephanie, I believe you're going to start sharing first. So just give you a second there to get set up, because these things always take a minute or two. And I would encourage everybody, you know, we still have a lot of people in our space here at the moment, so please do write down comments, ask questions throughout, and maybe if you feel confident enough that you can kind of raise your hand and ask a question at the end of this kind of 15 minutes. I do encourage you all to participate in that, because we have three nice kind of like variety, and there's a connection across the whole theme of EDI. So yeah, we can see your slides there if you want to go ahead, and I'll keep an eye on the time. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much, Tracy. Yes, hi everyone, my name is Stephanie Burns. I'm from the School of Psychology, alongside Gulsali Besu and Lida Sena as well. We are colleagues at the School of Psychology, and thanks for giving us this time today to present our research on perceptions of multicultural education in psychology higher education. So this is a quick overview of what we will present today. So firstly, I'll present the 5-dimensional understanding of multicultural education developed by James Banks that has underpinned all of this work. I'll then briefly present details of our qualitative pilot study, which explored multicultural education as it relates to psychology. I'll then outline the scale of multicultural education in psychology that was developed from this. And then my colleague and co-author Gulsali will then present the findings of the exploratory factor analysis that we carried out to examine the dimensions of the scale and the results of regression analyses that tested the relationships between the subscales of the multicultural education scale and 3 relevant student outcomes. And then we'll end with a discussion of findings. So we adopted the view of some of the major theorists of multicultural education that the 2 major objectives of multicultural education are firstly to be culturally inclusive, so that students from diverse backgrounds will experience educational equality, and also to develop intercultural competence and communication skills, so that all students will be able to adjust and thrive in this increasingly diverse world. And for this research, we started from Banks's 5-dimensional model of multicultural education. And this model goes beyond the early models of multicultural education, which focused mainly on recognizing differences. Banks's model outlines a more critical form of multicultural education where students engage critically with all cultural backgrounds, including their own, and recognize how identities are located within power structures. So in Banks's conceptualization, multicultural education includes, firstly, content integration, meaning that examples, evidence, and so on come from a variety of cultures and groups. And this can be clearly applied to psychology as a subject, which is often criticized because of its one-sided focus on what we call weird samples, so Western, educated, industrialized, rich, and democratic samples. And secondly, knowledge construction refers to what type of and whose knowledge is valued and not valued, whose story is told or remains invisible, which can again be applied to psychology in terms of the emphasis on weird societies. And thirdly, in equity, pedagogy includes diverse teaching methods and assessments to create equity in the learning experience for all students. And successful forms of this pedagogy can be informed by the insights of applied social psychological theory, such as Allport's contact theory. The fourth dimension outlined by Banks is prejudice reduction, which relates to the inclusion of topics in curricula such as prejudice, discrimination, and racism. And these topics have a high profile in psychology teaching. And then lastly, empowering school culture and structure means that the culture and the policies of a school are supportive of diversity and multicultural education. And in psychology as a discipline, many scholars examine the impact of such policies on feelings of belonging, leadership, and so on. So leading from this, we wanted to explore some of the potential outcomes of a multicultural educational experience. And we chose 3 for this particular study. So firstly, there is a large body of research that provides evidence for how multicultural education can lead to increased school belonging. And we go by the definition that this is about how valued, supported and accepted students feel in their school social environment, very like the mattering that was mentioned earlier. But a lot of this work has been done in post-primary schools and there's not as much within the university setting. Greater belongingness has also been related to enhanced identification with an academic domain, which can be defined as the extent to which an individual defines the self through their role or performance in a particular domain. So for instance, the extent to which being a psychology student is a valued part of a student's social identity. And such identification can influence motivation, and so it's an important student outcome. And lastly, past research would suggest that multicultural education within certain conditions can, should lead to students holding more positive attitudes towards culturally diverse groups. So to summarise this introduction, we had 4 key aims. To firstly explore psychology students and lecturers' understandings of multicultural education in psychology, and then to develop a new scale of multicultural education in psychology based on the qualitative data. Thirdly, we wanted to then test with a quantitative survey the internal structure of a new scale. And then lastly, we aim to examine the extent to which different aspects of multicultural education in psychology are associated with students' levels of school belonging, domain identification, and respect for diversity at university. So now I'm going to present the small pilot study that we carried out to meet the first 2 research aims. So on this basis, my colleague Goselli designed and carried out a small qualitative study to identify facets of multicultural education, specifically in psychology higher education. So she interviewed psychology teachers and students using interview questions that were rooted in Banks's framework. So to this end, the pilot study tapped into 3 research questions. How did the teachers and students perceive and understand multicultural education? What are the strategies teachers adopt for multicultural education? And what are the challenges that teachers and students experience with diversity and multicultural education? So the transcripts were analysed with thematic analysis, And these were the themes and sub-themes identified. So the first was to do with the curriculum. One sub-theme critiqued the overly Western focus of the curriculum and the need to diversify the curriculum in terms of examples, theories, samples, articles, books and authors and so on, and different cultural perspectives. And the second sub-theme referred to multicultural content in psychology, and this was in reference to the inclusion of topics such as prejudice and prejudice reduction and cross-cultural differences in psychology. The second main theme mapped onto one of Banks's key ideas, that of equity pedagogy, and this also had two sub-themes. So one was in reference to diverse teaching methods and assessment, and the other was around student agency and engagement. The third theme was about embedding of multicultural education in the school context, which was divided into the sub-themes of diversity of the staff and student body, and the school's institutional values and policies in terms of equality, fairness, cultural diversity and gender. So leading from the qualitative findings, a new scale to measure the extent to which a psychology course in higher education was perceived as multicultural or not was developed, with subscales reflecting the themes. So there was one 7-item scale of multicultural curriculum, a 7-item subscale of equity pedagogy, and because we suspected that the actual diversity levels of a psychology department and its values and policies may not always go hand in hand, you know, especially in low diversity national contexts like Northern Ireland, 2 subscales were developed to reflect the embedding and context theme from the qualitative data. So we had one subscale to measure the diversity and composition of the school context, and one to measure school values and policies. So here are some example items from each of the subscales, just to give you a sense of what the dimensions targeted. So I'll let you glance down through those for a second. So the wording of the items reflected both the findings from the qualitative study and the aspects of multicultural education outlined by Banks. But please do contact us if you wish to have a copy of the full scale. We'd be happy to share the full scale with you. So now I'm going to hand you over to Gilseli, who will talk us through the quantitative study and discussion of findings.
Hi everyone, I'm Gilseli. I hope the slides will go on. Okay, so let me time myself, sorry. So I will be talking about third and fourth research aim. So testing the internal structure of the new scale and looking at these associations via a quantitative study. So the survey we conducted among psychology students across UK, but admittedly most of our students were from NI, and most of them, 97% of them were from NI, and a majority of them from Queen's University. So we had a new scale of multicultural education and a number of relevant student outcomes like school belonging, domain identification with psychology, and respect for diversity. So the first thing we did was to run an exploratory factor analysis of this new scale, and more or less the factor structure actually confirmed our expectations. The first factor included all the 5 items of the school diversity and composition, and it turned out to be a reliable item. This is about student body and staff being racially, culturally, religiously diverse. The second factor, as we suspected, the values and policies turned out to be a separate factor from the student and staff diversity levels. And these were items about schools' value and cultural diversity and equality and fairness, and it was a reliable scale. The multicultural curriculum subscale had 7 items, but unexpectedly, it turned out to be 2 factors. But when we further looked at it, it's more of a methodological issue, because the second factor was the factor with reverse coded items, and both of these factors actually had very high correlation. So we decided to combine these 7 items as one scale. and it was it had an acceptable level of reliability. And finally, QUB pedagogy, again, unexpectedly turned out to be two factors. What we found that the diversity of teaching methods and student engagement was a separate factor from student agency or decision-making power. So we decided to keep them separate, but the student agency items, unfortunately, they didn't turn out to be correlated with each other either. So we had to exclude student agency from the scale and then kept the 4 items that refer to diversity of teaching and assessment methods to encourage active student engagement. So these are the levels. So what you see here, so the first 4 are the subscales of multicultural education. This is a scale running from 1 to 5. So most students agreed that agreed with the values and policies and QUB pedagogy, meaning that the schools of psychologies are valuing diversity and they endorse a variety of teaching methods and assessment methods to promote active student engagement. What was less agreed, and not surprising probably, is the levels of diversity at the staff and student level, which is diversity and composition here, and the lowest value was multicultural curriculum. And in terms of the student outcomes, you see that most students reported overall high school belonging, strong domain identification with psychology, and high respect for diversity. So let's look at
2 minutes, Giselle.
Okay, let's look at the regression outputs. What you see here, first, the 4 dimensions of multiculturalism scale, and looking at the school belonging, we see that when students perceive that they have a lot of opportunities to actively engage in classrooms and that their schools value cultural diversity, they reported higher school belonging. School values also had a positive effect on domain identification. And finally, for respect for diversity, it was similar. QUB pedagogy and school and values and policies had significant positive effects on respect for diversity. So to recap, in terms of the research aims, we show that students and lecturers' understanding of multicultural education actually tapped into the bank's understanding of multicultural education. We were able to create a reliable scale with 4 subscales, and we showed that students had the highest agreement on school values, school culture being supportive, and schools of psychology endorsing a variety of teaching methods, or the QUB pedagogy. And interestingly, these were the 2 factors which had significant effects on student outcomes as well. I will probably not have time for limitations, but cross-sectional design, obviously with student outcomes, we cannot really be sure. And in the future, we need a larger group of students, a variety of students to test confirmatory factor analysis, but also to investigate different students' understandings of multicultural education. I want to just end up with the takeaway message. Our results show that school culture and values are very important. When schools explicitly value cultural diversity, equality, and fairness, this had positive effects on student outcomes. Second was the QUB pedagogy, or the diversity of teaching methods and assessments to encourage student engagement, that also had positive effects on school belonging and to some extent respect for diversity. But what kind of our in a way negative way, what our research shows that schools of psychology at Queen's and beyond still has a lot to do on diversifying the content of curriculum in psychology. Thank you.
Thanks very much for that. So they were our 3 different sets of speakers in the second hour of under the theme EDI, and I would just I suppose encourage you all to turn on your cameras, the speakers I'm talking to. And if you want to raise your hand and ask anybody a question, that would be great. There was a real nice kind of continuum of a theme there around belonging and mattering, and trying to kind of change that kind of fixed mindset to more of a growth mindset around considering, you know, that there is really no one identity and that there's multiple identities and people draw from various things, and that we shouldn't assume anything. And things, I suppose everybody who spoke was definitely trying to inform some change and to get our learners thinking about things in a different way, and really try to, you know, I suppose dig deep around our own prejudice and our own stereotypes and our own biases, because we all have them. It's irrelevant of what your background is, and we all need to kind of have these check-ins ourselves every so often, because we all say things that we don't realize that might have a different meaning to the person that we're actually conversing with. I have a kind of initial question, just because it's fresh in my mind now. Sorry for the last group in psychology. I suppose, like, the term equity pedagogy. I strive in everything that I do personally towards equity, but my understanding from talking to a lot of other people, it would be very different, you know, even the difference between equality and equity. And was there a big difference? Like, how was that explained to our learners, and was there a difference of what a staff member might actually mean in terms of what a learner would mean around equity pedagogy? And is there even differences around our lectures of education, our lectures in research? Like, what does that mean? Because teaching and learning in Queen's is very different than in other institutions. So I want to kind of, for you to unpack that a little bit, and how you explain that, and what does it mean, and are people actually doing this in our School of Psychology?
So the way what we thought of equity pedagogy was in terms of the student agency, engagement, and the diversity of methods applied to meet the diverse needs of students. Of course, the qualitative part of the study, so there was a difference between the lecturers and students' understanding of student agency. Lecturers often thought of engagement as agency, whereas students themselves thought that they were encouraged to engage, but didn't necessarily appraise it as agency. And unfortunately, when it comes to the scale, we couldn't really measure agency either. I think this was kind of a limitation of this study. We need to better understand how we can measure agency in terms of students' decision-making power, in the content, in the assessment styles and teaching styles. So that was the part that was missing, I think, from our scale. We couldn't reliably measure it.
Okay, that's great. Thanks for that response. Does any of the speakers want to come in there? I see a hand up here. Sorry. Claire, yeah, do you want to come in and ask? I know you had added a couple of questions there. It'd be great to maybe.
And actually that discussion around belonging and mattering, your last answer has just made me wonder whether you, as researchers, you attribute the meaning of the words belonging and mattering, or did the students tell you the words were belonging and mattering? Did they say they felt they belonged or they mattered? Or have you taken from the language they've used an interpretation and assigned the words to the data from the students?
Well, we were using, for that last piece of research, we were using the school belonging scale. So it wasn't a scale that we developed from speaking to our students as such. It was a pre-published scale that showed that had good reliability and validity with other student samples, which was why we chose it. But I think it's a really good question to dig into. I think in terms of, you know, when you're talking about belongingness, are you talking about belonging at the group level or at the individual level? You know, and it's, you know, I think at that group level, it's about seeing yourself as connected to that larger group, you know, and sort of the things that come to with being connected to that larger group, like social connectedness, social mobility, social capital, all of those things. But I think the difference, the belonging at the individual level, is where we're talking about mattering and that sense of being valued as an individual, and that, you know, being respected for who you are, and yeah, accepted yeah, at that individual level, as I said. So that's how I would differentiate it.
Yeah, and I see Nicholas is still in the room there
right.
as well. If you just want to come in, Nicholas.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's interesting as well, that idea about seeing yourself in the group as being a group member. For our students, just thinking about equitable pedagogy as well, are globally distributed, and so that there is a challenge in the pedagogy to make them visible to each other and develop a sense of agency. And the way we do that is, or one of the ways we try and do that is have what we call a making culture as part of the pedagogy, so that the participants are invited in a series of activities to create digital representations of their thinking at any given point and on a particular task. And to give you a sort of a quick example, we invite them to create a tutorial. It can be in PowerPoint or anything, on how to create a YouTube playlist for education. And so there's this cognitive effort, if you like, toggling between the target of the playlist and then the construction of their own tutorial. And in doing that, the purpose of it is just to model. I mean, it's a trivial activity, but the purpose in the course is to model that and share their representations, and then we curate those as tutors to show the diversity that exists within the representations they create on the same trivial task. And doing that and sharing that in the forum as they do, so it's almost seen as preparation for the collaborative task, this construction of their own representation prior to sharing it with others. They then get this multiple perspectives that can inform their own thinking, and it's partly done to make them aware of the theory of constructivism, this cognitive diversity and different ways of thinking about a task, because they see for this very trivial task how diverse and different their interpretations and products are. And so in doing that and pooling them, it is an effort to help them literally see themselves in the group. In other words, to see their presentation as a representation of their thinking in the collection that's made visible and shared with everybody, wherever they are, whether they're in Asia, Europe, Africa, or wherever they are, just to try and sort of communify the online course, as it were. So that's just trying to respond to that point about equity in pedagogy, and also because the idea is it's driven by diversity rather than consensus. We're not seeking consensus.
Thanks very much. Sorry. No, that's okay. Thanks very much. I'm just conscious of time. And just before we go, I just have a very quick question for the middle group. So Grania and Dee and Mairead, and just drawing on what Nicholas said around those multiple kind of viewpoints, because I'm conscious of, we had a learner here, we had the student voice, we had Dee as a learning technologist. Grania, you work kind of two roles, I suppose, as a GP in practice and also kind of, teaching, and then Mairead as an EDI academic lead. So there's multiple roles there, and it's really interesting. And I have a keen interest in cultural humility, and I wonder, what did you learn as staff members, as academics? Because you might be doing this in many ways, but actually now really underpinning something and framing it under a theoretical viewpoint. Like, what did you learn as staff, and Dee, what did you learn as a learning technologist, and what have you brought into your own practice?
Lots of things, but one thing that really stands out is the benefit of having a student leading this project. This came from a summer studentship, and Ariana has stayed involved in it and will stay involved in the research side of it. And she was great at keeping us all on our toes, especially when we were thinking about the prompts and how to word them and the words to use. And I learned absolutely lots from her. That's just the first thing that comes to mind, but I'm sure the others have other things that they would like to say.
Well, for myself, said, you know, I've read a lot about, you know, diversity, and it's all the kind of theory. So it was great to actually, you know, kind of get this into practice, and particularly going forward. I mean, Grania, you know, the early clinical attachment program, it's, you know, primary care centred. So now in third year to be going out into hospitals. So it's about, I suppose, applying it more, and that, you know, rather than just in tutorials, you know, discussing it, we want to see it in action. So it's a great opportunity for, you know, for us to work towards that.
Great. And yourself, Dee?
Well, I suppose for myself it would be this sort of, I'm going to say identities, the belonging and the mattering, because, you know, if we didn't all take part within this, we wouldn't be highlighting some of the outcomes that have come to light, you know, and be able to talk about those and take that conversation forward.
And I suppose that kind of sums it up, that it's everyone's responsibility. You know, when we're talking about EDI in general, if we're talking about accessibility, if we're talking about belonging or mattering, it's really everyone's responsibility to think about this and to drive it forward. Okay, so it's 4 o'clock. I just want to say again a very appreciative thank you to all our speakers, not alone today, but over kind of the past 4 weeks in general, and all our keynote speakers. I really appreciate you all and value you all, and thanks very much for all your great work that you're doing. And I want to thank all the participants who've actively engaged and got involved in the chat and Twitter and whatnot. There is a feedback form, if you can click on it there in the chat. Ben and Julio just put it in. It takes about 3 to 4 minutes, you know, really short questions, just to give us a better sense of where we're going for future conferences and whatnot. So I just want to thank you all very, very much. You can give a kind of a virtual applause to everyone, and we can just let you all leave whenever you feel like you need to leave the room. Thanks.
Tracy,